welcome to Science on Tap. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for coming. My name is Susan Knight. I work at the University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea conceived in 1905, that the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. So welcome, everyone. At Science on Tap, we don't give you a lecture. We will just have our speaker give a few introductory remarks, and then we open it up to the floor for you to ask questions. So hopefully you've got lots. Our partners for Science on Tap are University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station, University of Wisconsin Kemp Natural Resources Station, and the Minocqua Public Library, and the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and of course our hosts here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. And we are always grateful to the Brittingham Fund, which funds our exploits here. Remember that there are 4 ways to watch. You can watch right here, like you all are, or you can go to the library where it is live streamed, and it's also usually live streamed at the Eagle River Library. And you can also watch at home if you've got a fast enough internet connection. And finally, we also archive all of our videos, as well as making a short 10-minute or so, sort of a compact version. They talk really, really fast. So anyway, let's see. Our next Science on Tap event will be January 2nd, the day after New Year's, right after the holiday. Our speaker will be Edna Chang. She's a PhD candidate at UW-Madison, and she's going to be talking about hibernation. So a good topic for winter. So hopefully she will not put you to sleep. Tonight we have Brian Heeringa speaking about bats. Brian's the wildlife biologist for the Washburn Ranger District of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. He received his degree from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and he's worked for the USDA Forest Service since 2003. In addition to coordinating the bat monitoring program on the National Forest, Brian works with a team of biologists to coordinate bat acoustic surveys across the eastern region of the Forest Service. Brian also works with sharp-tailed grouse, translocation project, and the restoration of globally imperiled pine barrens ecosystems. Brian grew up in Waupun, Wisconsin, where his father worked in law enforcement, and his family's background in law enforcement and his passion for wildlife biology and the outdoors led Brian to UW-Stevens Point to pursue environmental law enforcement. Through his involvement in the Stevens Point student chapter of the Wildlife Society, he realized his true passion was in wildlife biology and kind of shifted gears. So he started, I'm sorry, lost my place. His interest in bats started in college and built while he was working at the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest after graduation. Since then, Brian's been working with bats and advocating for their conservation as part of his professional and personal life. He says his work with bats has led to some of his favorite and most interesting experiences as a wildlife professional. When not chasing down bats or brats. I don't know if he has brats. Brian, you do, yes, he has brats to chase too. Brian likes to read, watch movies. He plays the drums for a local band. And he serves on the board of the Chequamegon Audubon Society. And of course, he likes to be outside. So here's your trivia question about Brian. One of the newer tools of the trade for wildlife biologists was a GPS unit. We're all familiar. It keeps them from getting lost, and they can record the location of whatever they're chasing that day. But even without the GPS, Brian says that he was pretty good at navigating the woods. But when he had the GPS in his hand, he found himself fidgeting with the GPS and not really looking where he was going. So one day, Brian was out in the field supposedly looking for goshawks, but mostly watching the GPS screen. What did he just about crash into when he was supposed to be looking where he was going? All right. A, skunk with 4 babies. B, a porcupine with 6 babies. Or a goshawk, the bird he was looking for. Goshawk. Brian Heeringa, thank you very much.
Thanks. have to say that I learned that day too that they're very fast flyers, and I learned how to duck and cover very quickly. Well, thanks for having me. As I was introduced, I'm Brian Heeringa, and bats are a passion of mine, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you about them. And just to start off, just a little background about bats. Bats have been around for about 50 million years, so they've been here a very long time. And in that time, if you've ever had a chance to see a fossil of a bat, you'll notice that they haven't changed a whole lot. So their presence on this planet, and as we'll talk about, their widespread distribution on our planet, is the reason why they're so important. They provide an enormous ecosystem function, as well as they provide an enormous benefit for our economy and our health. And so bats have been around a long time, and they're fascinating. As you look around the planet, you will see that there's about 1,300 plus different species of bats. They account for 1/5 of all the mammal diversity on the planet. So they are present everywhere. And in fact, some of you probably may have bats in your home in the summertime. So they are very important for us here in Wisconsin. Bats around the planet, you'll find that they exist in a variety of places. They are present within pretty much everywhere except the most desert and most polar extreme environments. And their bats, because they're so diverse, they have a variety of different things that they eat. You have bats that, as you know, eat insects. 70% of all bats, including all the bats in Wisconsin, eat insects. But then you also have bats that eat fruit, and they help disperse seeds because they're eating fruit. You have bats that actually eat frogs and fish out there. And of course, you know, if we were in Halloween in October, everybody likes to talk about bats around that time of the year. Of course, vampires. And the legend of Dracula, that came about even before we knew that there were vampire bats. So they aren't really connected. The only part that they are connected is that the vampire bats actually do require blood. And then, and as I mentioned, the bats that we have that eat insects, those are the ones here in Wisconsin that are the most important for us. So just to give you an idea of how many insects a bat here in Wisconsin may take out of the night sky in a given evening, in about 1 hour, a little brown bat can consume about 1,000 insects. So that bat's working pretty hard to get a meal. And to give you and even expand on that a little more, has anybody ever heard of Bracken Cave in Texas? If you have the opportunity, go visit. There's about 20 million bats that live in that cave. And so if you kind of extrapolate the numbers, those bats will eat about over 14 billion tons of insects every year. So that's a really hard number to kind of wrap your mind around. So I have this little anecdote that I often use with kids to kind of relay how much food or insects a bat eats. So in a given day, a bat needs to eat half or all the way up to its full body weight in food in an evening to maintain itself, especially if it's a female raising young. So we'll just assume that Brian needs to eat half my body weight every day. And so we'll say I'm about 210 pounds. So that's about 105 pounds of food I have to eat every day. So if I'm like really excited about Big Macs on a given day, you know, they weigh about half a pound. So I got to eat 210 Big Macs every day. And I know some kids, I ask them if, like, would you be able to do that? And they say, yeah, of course I could. But, who would want to eat that many? I'm not sure. But bats do have predators as well. And predators for bats here in Wisconsin can include owls, hawks, raccoons, and cats. And so that just kind of gets at that, bats are important in this world for other animals, not just us, for controlling insects and pests, but also as a food source for other animals. And of course, bats navigate with a very unique way of echolocation, where it's like sonar, and they can just shout out, a noise, and they get a response back. And sometimes it's like 500 pulses a second they can be emitting from their mouth. And some bats actually snort it. And so they'll actually be emitting their nose or their sound through their nose. And while a bat's echolocating, the sound is so loud that they actually have a mechanism in their ear that allows them to close their ear off. It's almost like an internal earplug. So to prevent damage to their sensitive ears that they need to hear these echoes back. So bats have a very sophisticated way of navigation that they can, it's thought that they can see everything except color with echolocation. They can avoid an obstacle as thin as a human hair as they're navigating. So bats use this to navigate, fly around, and find their food, avoid obstacles. And we use that echolocation in our research when we're trying to figure out what bats are on the landscape and to look at relative population trends to try to get a baseline of data to monitor populations as they're affected by diseases like Whitenose syndrome and other impacts. So how many of you listen to birds or go bird watching? I know there's a few people in here that do bird counts. So you use your ears to identify birds. But with bats, it's different. We can't hear it. It's ultrasonic. So we use devices to record and translate that information into a way that we can look at it. So we often use computers to look at their calls on the screen. And so we can identify bats relatively well by this process. So that allows us one way to look at and study bats on the environment. I already talked about the distribution of bats a little bit. There's 47 species in the United States and Canada, to kind of give you an idea of how many bats call the United States home. We have bats that are categorized in the group Chiroptera, or all the bats are actually in the scientific order Chiroptera, which means hand wing. And so their wings are actually designed just like our hands, except for obvious reasons, their finger bones are elongated and then there's a webbing that creates their wing. All the bats in Wisconsin are Microchiroptera, so they're very small. They're in a group of bats that there's about 800 species in this group. They're very diverse and they're found all around the world. Now there's another group, and this is the one group that most people probably see in movies and that. They're the Megachiroptera. They're also commonly called flying foxes because they look like little foxes with wings. And these bats represent some of the largest bats that we have in the world, with a wingspan of one species reaching about 6 feet. And this group also has one of the heaviest bats, which is about 2.5 pounds. The Microchiroptera on the other side are much smaller, and they have the world's smallest bat, which is about the size of your thumb. So that just kind of gives you the diversity of the bats that we have out there. In Wisconsin alone, we have 8 species of bats. And commonly in this area, based on surveys that have been done by the Forest Service and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and some of you in this room may volunteer in the summertime to carry a bat detector around and help survey bats. We have 6 of these species commonly found up here. So we have the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, the big brown bat, and the eastern red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat. The little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the big brown bat, and one that I didn't mention, the tricolored bat, which is found more in the southern part of the state, are all state-threatened species due to the threat of Whitenose syndrome. And additionally, the northern long-eared bat is a federally threatened species because of the disease. And so our bats are kind of broken up into 2 general groups. We have cave bats and we have tree bats. And it can kind of be deceiving when I say tree bats because really all bats use trees in the natural environment. Even the bats that I'm calling cave bats use trees. However, what I'm looking at is kind of like how they handle wintertime. So we just talked about hibernation. It was a great segue into this kind of talk, is bats hibernate. The cave bats require hibernation to survive winter when water and their food source isn't available. So the little brown bat, the big brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolored bat are all bats that will make short local migrations, maybe at the most 250 plus miles, and hibernate. They'll go into a cave or a mine in order to survive winter, where temperatures are more stable, it's humid. And a lot of our bats here, go into the upper peninsula of Michigan. There's a lot of mines, as we know, up there that they utilize. And there's also, they may fly a little further south towards maybe Door County in southern Wisconsin, where there's a lot more cave and karst features. The other group of bats, the silver-haired, eastern red hoary, and evening bat, they're tree bats. They actually migrate south. So these bats will go as far south as they need in order to have more temperate conditions, because they'll spend a lot of their time in the winter maybe on trees, on bark or under bark. So they need conditions that are a little better. So with our bats in Wisconsin, they're very available. We're a farming state. You know, we have a lot of agriculture here. So in Wisconsin alone, bats, as far as avoided pest control, provide farmers a savings of about $700 million to $1.5 billion every year. So that's a lot less, that keeps us from having to put a lot of pesticides and herbicides on our crops. Nationally, they save farmers about $3 billion a year. So that's a good reason why we want to keep bats here. And so bats, more than half of the bats in the United States are threatened today. Unfortunately, populations are declining worldwide, and some of the biggest threats that we have to bats are, of course, habitat loss and human interactions, such as disturbance at sites, the use of pesticides and insecticides that affect the crops and insects. Another one is climate change, potentially could be having effects on bats, is ecosystem shift and phenology of certain plants may shift, insects may come on the landscape and not have food, and then that, of course, trickles down to not providing food to bats. And then wind energy development is very important for us to have renewable resources, but as we know, wind farms can impact birds, but they also can impact bats. And then the biggest concern, a lot of you have probably heard about Whitenose syndrome, and that's one thing I just want to take a little time to talk about if I got some time still. And it's called one of the most precipitous declines in wildlife species has been observed from Whitenose syndrome. And Whitenose syndrome was first detected in the United States in 2006. And since then, we've learned that it's in Europe, in Asia, and that's likely where it came from. And from that time, it's marched across the United States. Pretty much it kind of infiltrated through the Northeast, and then it started to progress westward, and then kind of south, and it made a big jump all the way to Washington State a few years ago, to the point that now we are affected by Whitenose syndrome pretty much across the United States. 33 states have Whitenose syndrome, along with 7 Canadian provinces. And so how this disease is moving so effectively is that it's affecting bats at that critical time in their life when they're hibernating. The fungus is actually a soil-loving fungus, or psychrophilic. And so that means it's a cold-loving fungus. And so a lot of caves, as you know, are cool, damp, and they have a stable temperature, which is perfect conditions for this fungus to grow in. And these cave environments act like an environmental reservoir for this fungus and this disease to build up into. And because we have bat species that more than half of the bats in the United States require hibernation to survive, these bats need to go into these sites to survive. So they're being put into a place in a situation that they're encountering this fungus regardless of what we do right now. And so even if a site where bats were to die out in a cave or a mine and be gone for several years, and then bats were to come back in again, they would still get the fungus because it naturally resides in the soil. So signs and symptoms of this fungus that we look for when we're doing our wintertime surveillance in these caves and mines are bats will have, as it gets its name from, like a powdery white substance that will form on its nose or its other soft tissues like its wing membranes. And so it's not only that sign, that's an indication that they have it, but bats will start to behave differently too. When a bat's hibernating, its body basically kind of shuts down. It goes into standby mode. You know, their heart rate slows, their breathing slows, their body temperature actually drops within a degree or two of their surrounding environment, and their immune system even shuts off in a way. So this gives the fungus an opportunity to invade its skin. And so as it irritates the bat's skin, it causes bats to wake up more frequently. Normally bats, when they're hibernating, kind of wake up. Like we'll sometimes wake up in the middle of the night just to either shift where we're sleeping, go to the bathroom, or so on. Bats do the same thing occasionally every 2 to 3 weeks. But white-nose syndrome is causing them to wake up more frequently. So they're burning through their energy reserves, and they're dehydrating, and that's what's causing a lot of bats to die. And if some of you have maybe seen in the springtime, really early spring when we still have snow and ice, bats are flying outside. And as a last-ditch effort to survive, a lot of bats are actually leaving their hibernation sites to look for insects, to look for water, and that's detrimental. And so Wisconsin, unfortunately, detected white-nose syndrome in 2014. So we've been with the disease for quite a while now, and within the first 3 years, or at least by the third year that white-nose syndrome shows up at a site, you start to see the large die-offs of bats. So you can see anywhere from 80 to more than 90% of a particular population die off from white-nose syndrome within a couple years. And so an estimate in 2012 was that about 6 million bats had died from white-nose syndrome at that time. And so a new estimate hasn't been given, but you can kind of assume from 2006 to 2012 when that number was determined, that's about 1 million bats a year are dying. And when you understand that bats are one of the slowest reproducing mammals on our planet for their size, only having 1 young a year, that can be really detrimental, particularly for those bats that are surviving and coming out of hibernation with maybe injuries to their wings and they need to heal and try to build up their immunity or build up their energy stores again. The females that might be coming out of hibernation that would potentially be giving birth that spring may not be able to because they would have been affected by the disease. So it's not only killing bats, but the few that are surviving may also be impacted, just not being able to function properly initially after leaving hibernation or giving birth to young. And so a lot of research has been done, and it's not all gloom and doom. There's a lot of really good stuff that's going on out there, and a lot of good research, and there's ways for you all to get involved in helping to learn about bats. Some of the research going on, of course, as a cure would be ideal, and there are some vaccinations that are being created, and there's nothing positive now, but the biggest issue is even if something were to be created is how do you disperse a vaccine to a group of animals that in some cases there's millions of them at sites, or they're so now dispersed across the landscape and there's so few of them that you might not be able to vaccinate them all. So there's a lot of work being done in clever ways in how to vaccinate. They're looking at powders that you could apply to roost sites in the summer where bats can self-inoculate by going across the powder, and then they groom it off of themselves and then disperse it that way. Aerosolizing vaccines as bats go through an entryway into a site that they can get misted. Creams that you would apply to bats, and they would also groom it and spread it throughout the environment. And so there's a lot of beneficial things as far as vaccines go. There's also research, and a lot of us actually, and we should be proud of this as our state, is we're kind of leading the charge. Wisconsin is very proactive. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources BAT program is really involved with some of this, and a lot of the field trials that are happening right in our state. So it's very cool that we can be a part of that. And there also some of the field trials are not only looking at treating bats, but the environment that they're in. How can you remove the fungus from these caves and mines? A lot of caves have a whole functioning biotic ecosystem of their own that you don't want to destroy potentially by putting a fungicide in there that would just kill everything. So there's a lot of other variables that have to be considered. But some of the artificial sites like old army bunkers or mines provide an opportunity for us to go in and see about removing that fungus that causes white-nose syndrome in an easier capacity. Also, how is the disease being transmitted? I don't know, some of you may have seen the article that recently came out that showed the candy-colored bats. There's a research group working on a study that they're using fluorescent powders with UV lights that basically makes the powder fluoresce. So you powder a bat. So I was involved with one part of this study. I got to observe a bat being powdered bright yellow and one bright pink and bright blue, and then you release them into the hibernation site. And then you come back weeks later and you use the UV light to go and see where every little speck of powder in different colors show up. And so you can see actually that one little bat in one little part of a site actually can impact the whole group, even though it might just be here. As they're flying, like the powder just dissipates. So it's a really interesting and unique way that scientists are looking at how a disease or a fungus that causes this disease gets moved through a population. But locally, we have a really great opportunity to help learn about bats that are in our environment and also ways that we can help improve habitat for them. So as I mentioned, you can get involved with citizen science projects and volunteer with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. They have an acoustic monitoring program where you can sign up to take a walking route, a canoeing route, or a boating route around a lake or down rivers, or you can do a driving route with a bat detector and put a microphone right on the top of your car and cruise down the road and hope to record some bats. Have a partner, though. Take somebody with you, because some of those nights driving 30 miles at 20 miles an hour steady can seem like it takes forever. But then there's also roost monitoring you can sign up for. Every spring and summer, you can get involved if you have a bat colony in your house that you like being there and you want to help record how many are there in the spring before babies are born, and then you record them when after the babies are born so you can see the increase in population. Or if you have bat houses, it's a way to get involved. It's up by where I live in Washburn. I get a group of people together and coordinate with a local conservation group, and we get together and count as a group at a site, and it's a lot of fun. So that's another opportunity. But in your own backyard, put up a bat house. It's Christmas time. They make great Christmas gifts. In fact, I have to, one of these times, I'm going to get to I think they're listening. My parents should be listening. I gave them one, and it's not up yet. So we need to take care of that. But the ground's frozen now, so I guess next year. But they do make good Christmas gifts. But also encourage good bat habitat in your own backyard. Even if you don't have a pond or you only have a couple trees, there's ways you can improve your own habitat for bats. So a lot of you may have heard of native plant gardens, native flower gardens, but you can do bat gardens as well. And basically, it's the same thing as a native flower and plant garden, but you put a bat house in it. Or you plant flowers that open up at nighttime to encourage insects to be around that garden. It's true. You're laughing over there, but it's true. There are plans online that recommend bat gardens for different hardness zones in the state. So you could find one that meets your own requirements for your yard and the type of plants to grow. Get out and go to different educational things. I don't know if any of you made it up to Ashland this year for the Wisconsin Bat Festival, but we have those mostly every year. There's National Bat Week. It's usually about the end of October. Great ways to get involved there. But then also reducing non-native invasive species in the area is really key, because those outcompete native plants that generally can potentially shift the type of insects that are out there. So you might be reducing the food available to bats by allowing non-native invasives to exist. Plus, if you have burdocks, really recommend getting rid of them. They're not only a pain in the butt for us, but they can capture bats and birds, and they die. I have observed it myself at our Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center in Ashland. We found a big brown bat that had been trapped on a burdock plant and died. So it's really important to encourage a healthy ecosystem. And our goal really for doing all this stuff and being engaged with, you just being here tonight shows an interest in the subject of bats and bat conservation. It's really to keep bats here for as long as we can to allow them the time to adapt to white-nose syndrome and to survive, and to give them these opportunities by helping to encourage the habitat that they need, which includes summer and wintertime habitat.
We have a sealed fireplace that obviously is not on in the springtime. And one year we had a bat in there, a little bat, and he died. What would be the proper way to get him out alive?
So you have a sealed chimney, that at least it's closed in the.
Right.
So he must have gotten down.
I don't know how
the
he got in
chimney
there.
and that. So a lot of times, because there's liners in some chimneys. I'm guessing this one has a liner in it.
It does, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in like buckets that people have left kind of on the inside a shed or whatever with the top open. So if the bats can get in there, and the sides are really smooth so they can't climb out or fly out. The way bats fly is not like birds where they can just flap their wings and take off. They need a little room they're awkward on the ground. So what I'm thinking happened there is the bat got in there and just couldn't crawl back out, couldn't fly out, so it ended up just dying in there. And
Well, he was alive.
oh, he was alive.
He was alive.
Okay.
But he died in there because there was, soot and stuff inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have liked to have gotten him out, but what's the safe way of doing it?
If you were able to open it and allow the material to drop out, or like in a container, and have leather gloves on so you could pick the bat up, that would be really the only way. It'd be really hard to get the bat out of that situation without injury. And sometimes wildlife just get in situations like that. We create a really good environment for them to be in with our homes and that, so they're drawn into particular situations. So to prevent that in the future, just making sure that, the cap that's on the chimney is appropriate. And
Well, there is a cap and a screen. I don't know how he got in there.
and bats, and that's the thing with bats. Bats are one of these groups of wildlife that interact with people a lot more frequently than others, just because of their ability to get into our homes. They only need a space of like 3/4 of an inch or less to get in. If they can fit their skull through a hole, they can fit the rest of their body through. So the nice thing is about bats is they don't chew. So if you have holes that could potentially allow access to bats into your home and you can seal them up, they won't chew a new hole. That's not how they're not rodents, so they don't chew things. So really just taking the time to look at your house and look for those little gaps where bats could access, and then sealing them up would be one good way to prevent them from getting in the future.
Got another question back here.
I don't like microphones. So there's those awful. There's an awful.
They can't hear you online if you don't.
Oh, all right. Jeepers. We hear these percentages of losses of the hibernating bats. What kind of losses are they seeing in the migratory ones due to the non-white-nose factors?
Sure. So with the migratory bats, it's much harder to get a estimate on a population. Bats are a really hard group of animals to study just because of the way they fly at night. They kind of are across the landscape. And so as a biologist, when you're trying to look at an animal population, it's best to try to census them during times of the year when they're congregating. So a lot of, we do our breeding bird surveys in the spring when they're on the landscape and actively calling. We do a lot of other bird surveys when they're dancing on a lek or dancing ground. Same thing with bats. So our cave bats, we go in the wintertime when they're all hibernating. So you can count them when they're at sites and you can get an idea of the population. With the tree bats that migrate, it's really hard because the way that they are on the landscape is they're more solitary. It's really rare to find a group of red bats together. So the population knowledge isn't so good. But what we do have are mortalities that are detected at different sites. So like wind farms, for example, a lot of wind farms out there employ biologists and summer technicians to do surveys underneath their wind farms to look for direct strikes or other mortalities. So there's a lot of work being done to look at effects of them on tree bats in particular are affected by these wind farms because on the landscape, these big turbines look like trees to bats. And so they're curious by nature, and they go to investigate and then get killed. And so some of the studies being done there are showing that tree bats are being impacted. I don't want to give you any specific numbers, but they are fairly high. And at one point, they thought numbers were approaching levels of Whitenose syndrome early on. But there's work being done for deterrence in that to try to keep bats from going into these areas. I know that wasn't a perfect answer, but tree bats are really hard to get population estimates on.
Yeah, I wonder what can you tell us, especially about our bats here in Wisconsin, as far as the reservoir for rabies? We all hear if you see a bat out in the daytime, be nervous, like raccoons and other things. Do we have an issue with bats carrying rabies in this part of the country?
Yeah, this questions about rabies come up quite often, and rabies is a virus that should be taken seriously, and like any mammal, bats get rabies. But in our part of the state, if you look at the United States, CDC kind of shows the more prevalent strains of rabies and shows which animals give rabies, or at least the interactions there. So raccoons are pretty high, and bats are pretty high in our state. Skunks are as well, I believe. And the reason that bats get a really bad rap for it is, like I was talking about earlier, they're one of the groups of species that interact with us so well. They get into our homes and that, and we don't see them because they're at night. And then when you said, like you said, you see them during the daytime, alarm bells go off in your head. And it's thought that less than 0.1% of bats actually have rabies. They're very clean animals, and they groom themselves in that. And colonies are generally pretty healthy, but with wild animals, they do get sick. So the chances of rabies are small, but you always want to treat a wild animal with respect and handle them with leather gloves if you can. If there's any kids out there, get an adult to help you. Always wear gloves and treat them like wild animals and move them somewhere safe. Bats occasionally come out during the daytime, particularly in the early spring, late winter, like I was talking about. If there's a population affected by whitenose, you might see them, but every once in a while a bat might get disturbed and might fly out during the daytime. So it's nothing unusual, I guess, to see one occasionally flying. But if you do see one on the ground, bats don't want to be there. They're able to be accessed by predators and get injured and things like that. So that is something to be concerned about. And any bat on the ground that I see, potentially, I think, could be injured or sick. So I'll pick it up wearing my gloves and move it somewhere safe where it won't get in the way or be impacted by somebody else or another animal or something like that. But I guess to sum that up, prevalence of rabies in bats is fairly small, and really no more common than any other mammals out there like raccoons and skunks and that. It's just that we interact with bats because of their ability to get into our dwellings and that a lot more, and that's why you have more human cases of people being bit by bats.
A question here.
Brian, where's the best place to find plans for building a bat house for your yard?
Yes, perfect question. There's a lot of places out there. If you go to Bat Conservation International, I bought a whole book from them. In the past, it's a Bat House Builder's Handbook. And there's a lot of other books you can purchase online. But I like to plug my state counterparts a lot. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, if you go to their website and you go into their little search box they have and just type in bats, it'll bring you to their bat program page. And they have some excellent resources for everybody out there. They have a free bat house booklet that you can download that has recommendations on where to place them, and then it has plans for, I think, for like 3 or 4 different styles of bat houses. And while I'm on that topic, they also have good resources for if you have bats in your house and you're looking for ways to humanely exclude them from your house and the good times of the year to do that so you don't trap baby bats in your house. And so a lot of great resources on the Department of Natural Resources website.
What kind of diseases are on the floors of these bat caves?
What kind of diseases are on the floors of the bat caves?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it looks kind of yucky.
Well, yeah, as you can imagine, like Bracken Cave, I have not been there myself. It's on my list to get there. I've been told that you can smell the guano outside the cave because, well, 20 million bats, that's a lot of deposits every evening. So, anyway, so yeah, there's a whole ecosystem that relies on that guano, and so there's a lot of diseases that. So if you have, and this is a good segue into if you have bats in your house and you have a fairly large colony, you're going to be accumulating guano and urine in your attic space, and so if you're going to clean that up, blastomycosis and some of those diseases, they're blood diseases you can get from inhaling the bacteria from the guano. That's something to be concerned about for sure. And if you're handling any of that, definitely look online for the best procedure. But when I crawl up into attic spaces and that, and I'm encountering, or when I'm going into some of these sites that have a lot of guano and potential for that, I'll wear a respirator. And then sometimes goggles to keep the dust out of my eyes. So I take some precautions, like even like one of those kind of Tyvek painter suits to keep some of that off from my clothes. But yeah, those like blastomycosis and histoplasmosis is another one. And then I'm blanking on the other one. But there are a few that are associated with accumulations of waste, guano and urine. Yeah.
We have a question online.
Question came in. Following up on your windmills, what is it about windmills that attract bats and cause high bat mortality?
Like I was saying, it's to a bat, these are pretty large structures and sometimes built in agricultural fields and that have adjacent forested habitat. And so these things usually rise above those, to get into that wind column, essentially, to take advantage of that. And they look like big trees. And so bats roost in trees, like I was saying, like naturally on the landscape, bats will spend their time in trees, whether in cavities caused by woodpeckers or lightning strikes, cracks and crevices, loose bark. But these trees aren't on the landscape forever. They're falling down. And so bats, and through some of the research that's been done in tracking bats, they found that bats will switch roosts all the time. So they're always looking for maybe a roost on the landscape to spend the evening or the daytime. And so to the bat, they look like big trees. And so they go to investigate. And there's some great thermal footage of bats flying up to the turbines as they spin, and it just follows the blade as it goes. It's just, I don't know if it's, just that movement cutting through the air draws them in, but they are drawn to these turbines from their presence on the landscape, and there is mortality caused by a direct strike from the blade hitting the bat, but there's also research that showed that bats are dying from barotrauma, which is what happens when a bat gets behind the blade as it slices through the air. There's a small low pressure pocket that's created behind the blade, and as a bat enters that, it essentially explodes their lungs, and then they end up dying. So some of the bats they find dead underneath these turbines don't have any outward sign of physical trauma. And then when they looked at it closer, they found out that their capillaries in their lungs and that were actually destroyed.
Question right here.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, we had bats in our house, and as much as I love bats, but not really that much, I hired a pest control guy to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
And he put up these nets over our rooftop, and the bats could get out, but the bats couldn't get back in. So I was kind of curious, well, how does that work? That you can put a net and they can get out, but they can't get back in. So do you know anything about how that works? I know you're not a pest control guy. But,
No, but I do work with some of that in the regard that, you know, the Forest Service, we have buildings that we own and maintain, and some of the buildings get bats in them. And so I have to deal with excluding bats, just like you were talking about. And that is one method. It's usually a one-way excluder, so you're covering the entryway so the bats can get out but not back in. And bats, the way that they interact with their roost sites is they can't just you know, like fly right into a hole or a cavity. They usually land and crawl in. So if you put the screen or net over the hole and it's just loose enough where they can get out and crawl out and fly out, they'll land on it. The idea is that they'll land on it. They won't remember they have to crawl all the way down and in and up. They'll just land there and they can't get in, and then they'll eventually give up and leave. And even using pieces of PVC duct tape to these things, bats will fall out, but then they can't grasp onto the bottom and they can't crawl back up in. So there's a lot of ways that you can create these one-way exits that the bats can't get in. But the key is to do it during times of the year that females don't have their pups. So I guess, you know, like as you get into the end of April when bats are coming back on our landscape from hibernation, all the way through until, you know, I generally won't think about exclusions until I'm getting into August when bats are, you know, the young should be flying by then and bats are starting to leave to head to their hibernation sites for the winter time already.
I noticed that we have had about 3 years where we've not seen any bats at all. We used to be able to walk outside and go fishing or something in the evening, and you'd feel like you had to duck because there were so many skimming along the top of the water.
Yeah.
I bought 2 years ago, I bought a bat house and set it up the way I was shown to do it. And my question is odd because what I'm asking is, how can you attract something that seems to be gone?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one that a lot of people are struggling with. When I say put up bat houses, they'll often say, well, why? There's no bats left. It's a good observation that you have. There are fewer bats out there, and that is because of Whitenose syndrome. All the sites that our bats hibernate in, that I'm guessing the bats that are here in Minocqua, or Wisconsin, all of the major sites have Whitenose syndrome. So, and it's been there long enough that we've seen the mass die-offs of some of these bats. So the few that come back every year, there's fewer of them. So having your bat house up in the right way is the best thing that you can do. You know, like it's on the landscape, it's getting its 6 to 10 hours of sun a day, it's up high enough, it's painted dark brown and black. There's really no good way of attracting bats in there. Some people thought that you could put guano on the bat house, but that doesn't really work. It's just really putting it in the best spot and hoping that bats that are in the area will notice it and start to use it. So I tell people that, you know, it's still important to put up bat houses because the bats that are coming back, the ones that do survive Whitenose syndrome, they make it through winter and defeat the odds, and they make it through. They really rely on having high-quality habitat to come to in the summertime, or places that they can roost in or potentially raise a baby if they can. So by having your bat house up, you're giving another opportunity for some bats that may be coming back. And so I have a bat house at my home that hasn't had bats in for over 4 years, but I see bats flying by, so I'm going to leave it there just for the chance. But I also want to say that even though you don't see large numbers of bats using your bat house, you could have 1 or 2 that show up there. So you might be providing a safe place for 1 or 2 bats or a handful to be at. And bats use these places at nighttime too. They're not just there in the daytime. When bats are out hunting at night, you know, catching 1,000 insects in an hour is hard work. and then sometimes you need to take a little nap. So bats will use night roosts, we call them, and they'll actually come to sites, and they might not be the same sites they sleep in during the day, but they'll go there to rest, to digest their food, and sometimes you might even see insect pieces on the ground where they'll bring in something they captured and chew on it, and you'll see the wings and exoskeleton down there. I used to live in an apartment that every morning I'd wake up and there'd be a little pile of guano on the patio. They were just using the side of the apartment for a night roost. So, it's frustrating because you put up the bat house and you want to get bats there. I would say just give it a shot, and hopefully some will come there. And it is discouraging knowing that bats are fewer and fewer of them on the landscape, but I just think having bat houses up is just another way to encourage or at least provide the habitat they need, or at least might help them from not going in your house too, if having an alternative outside.
We have another question online.
Question from the Monaco Public Library. Was Whitenose syndrome always here, or was it a recent arrival?
Recent arrival. Whitenose syndrome showed up, or at least it was documented in 2006 in New York State. And so at first it was a caver photographed this fungus that was on the bats that looked weird. And there are natural funguses and bacteria out there in caves and that some of them actually do resemble Whitenose syndrome, but at the time it wasn't something they'd seen before. So then they did a little more looking and found out that this is new, and the fungus is actually an invasive species. It comes from Europe and Asia. The same species of fungus has been found over there. And the bats over there are affected, but they don't die off like ours do. So there's research looking at the genetic history of the fungus to see how long it was potentially in Europe, in the European and Asian countries, and then, then looking at the bats that are living with it. There's the fat bat hypothesis that some of the bats over there that are living with it are a little bigger in body mass, so that when they go into that hibernative or torpor state, that state of deep sleep, that they have more body mass and they can withstand the more frequent wake-ups. So, but to the United States and Canada, North America as a whole, this is a new fungus and is an invasive species. Yeah.
You mentioned that bats are not rodents. They sure look a lot like rodents. Do they have a common ancestor? How are they different from rodents? And how do mother bats raise their young? Why do they only have one pup? And what are the complexities of an animal that hangs from its feet upside down in raising pups? How do they actually do it?
Oh, wow, that's a basket full of questions there. Well, let's see. Well, bats have been around for 50 million years. So, so there's the mega and microchiroptera. So the big fruit-eating bats that look kind of like flying foxes, there's thought that there was a way down in the lineage that there's some flying lemurs that may have made the jump. So there's some I don't know 100%, but there's some research that was being done looking at that ancestry. And then there's discussion about, well, how did bats evolve this ability of, like flying at night, and there's some recent research that came out that, well, actually there's bats that fly during the daytime. So what's the stressors that created them, pushed them into this niche? And really it's predators. There's some islands in tropical, forgetting exactly where they are, but they lack daytime aerial predators. And where those predators don't exist, bats fly during the day all the time, or for the most part. So there's that. They don't share an ancestry with rodents like mice or anything. Their whole structure of their skull is different. Their teeth are very fine. They don't continue to grow. Rodents always have to chew. Bats' teeth are very fine for capturing, like I'm speaking to our microchiroptera and those species that eat insects and that. So there's no connection there. as far as like genetically and evolutionarily down the tree, I might have to do a little more research to eloquently answer your question about that. But one little piece of information that I did glean, though, is that bats are more closely related to us and primates than they are to rodents. So there's a closer connection there. Bats having one young a year, there are some that have two. And like the eastern red bat occasionally has twins, and there's a few that do. But my guess is that it's energetically expensive for bats to do that based on their size and the way that they forage. So bats will actually will do most of their breeding in the fall before hibernation. So in August and September, they're going to multiple, and this is also a reason why white-nose syndrome spreads so well, is that they visit multiple hibernation sites and they interact with a bunch of different bats and they do mating, and then they finally pick their hibernation site and they go to it, and the female stores the sperm through winter, and then in springtime fertilizes the egg, and then she goes out onto the landscape and then raises the young. So it's a very unique system that I would imagine is very costly to the female. So generally one young a year. And they're very long-lived species. So bats, there's a bat out there that is over 40 years old. There's a bat in Wisconsin that was over 34 years old based on, it was banded in Minnesota and hibernated in Wisconsin, and every year they would find it, and they knew when it was abandoned and it was over. So when you have an animal that lives that long, having multiple young is really difficult. What else did you have in that?
Upside down.
How do they raise the young?
Ah.
They don't sleep upside down and give birth hanging upside down.
No, they do hang upside down, and bats have evolved that ability. I would, to take advantage of a lot of unique roosting structures. Bats actually, and this is kind of tangential, but they have a unique tendon. Like if we were to hang upside down or hold with our hands and we fell asleep, we relax. Bats' tendon works the other way. When it's relaxed, it locks their toes in so they can sleep and not worry about falling. Back to giving birth. They will turn around and capture the young in their tail membrane. And then the young will climb up and basically affix themselves to the female to have a ready supply of food. And early on, the female bats will fly around with their young until they're too big for her to fly. And she'll leave them in the roost and forage and come back and feed the young and so on and so forth. So.
A question here?
This is probably going to be a ridiculous question. In addition to radar and sonar, are fireflies giving it up when they flash their lights to bats?
Okay, so say that again.
Keep this way. Try it.
What?
Ask your question again.
Radar and sonar. So you're saying fireflies because they're blinking?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So if anybody knows better than this, let me know. I'm not an entomologist and don't really know too much about fireflies specifically, but they are, I believe some species are toxic to predators, and you can tell different species of fireflies based on the way they blink. Not that animals are interpreting this, but some have determined that animals can figure out which ones are toxic and avoid them. With bats, I'm not sure what percentage of their diet could be fireflies, and if they're taking advantage of the light they're seeing. I couldn't say, but with their echolocation, they wouldn't need the light at all. They would just be able to find it, regardless if the little butt was lit up or not.
With the white-nose syndrome so prevalent, is there any hope for recovery, or is there anything that can be done or is being done to help the species recover?
Yeah, and that is a concern in recovery. The northern long-eared bat, for example, is a species of bat that was listed federally threatened because of the disease, simply because the populations in the Northeast took such a drastic was such a drastic decline. Some of my colleagues on national forests out there do not record little brown bats or northern long-eared bats. They don't even capture them in nets anymore. So for all accounts and purposes, they could be locally extinct in that area. And that's a concern with some of these species that might be in low numbers across the landscape, is that because of white-nose syndrome, their numbers could get too low where their population's just not viable and can't be supported anymore. So unfortunately, you know, like, it's a race against the clock, really, to find a vaccine that could cure it. While that's going on, one of the big things is how to slow it down, how to slow the spread of white-nose syndrome down. And a lot of the methods I talked about with, like, decontaminating hibernation sites, or even to reduce the fungal load at a site to, like, the first year of infection where the bats aren't dying off yet. They can live with the fungus if it's a low enough level, but as the fungus builds up its population within a site, it's just too much, bats can't avoid it. So there's work being done to see if we can't get rid of it, maybe we can just reduce the fungus to a level that bats can live with it. And really, the goal is to keep bats here long enough with the work that we're doing to allow them time to adapt on their own, so that they have a built-in immunity to it, or at least they maybe, you know, like the bats in Europe, maybe they start to bulk up a little more and they can withstand the fungus. So there's nothing that we can do to really save this species. I know there's even, you know, somebody might say, well, there's some species that you take into captivity and then you do captive breeding programs. And, you know, like, there's a lot of examples out there where wildlife managers will do that, and then they release it, and then it, you know, proliferates on the landscape again. But with bats, particularly these small bats, there's very few of them that do well in captivity. So they just don't live long enough. Their requirements for survival just aren't being met in captivity. So it's a very complicated question, but really it's just trying to buy the bats time so that they can adapt.
I was just wondering about do bats have a language? Do they have different calls like birds have mating calls, or do they do, you know, for their hunting, do they have one specific call, and then when they're in a group, a different call?
Yes, they do. So when I talked about how we can't necessarily hear them, bats do actually make social calls. So they're audible. Like, I have some bats that I use for education. They're non-releasable bats that were rescued, and when they're upset with each other, or I go in there to fill the water bowl, they you know, audibly vocalize at me their discomfort with me being in their presence. So you might hear that if you hear bats in your attic or in your siding. So those are like social calls, or at least just audible calls. If you have really good hearing, you can actually hear some bats echolocating, like the hoary bat echolocates at a level that we can. To go further in your question, when we're looking at the bat call on our computer screen, bats from different species will echolocate at different frequencies, and they have different shapes to each call pulse. Some bats look very close to each other, like the big brown bat and the silver-haired bat can almost look the same when you're looking at them on the computer, but there are some diagnostic calls that they make that you can split them apart and say that's a big brown or a silver-haired. When you get comfortable with looking at these sonograms, these visual representations of their calls, you can tell when a bat's just flying down an open road, for example. It's just a steady pulse. But then when it finds something it's interested in, it speeds up its pulse, and it increases in frequency a little bit. And so what that's doing is it's giving the bat more information. There's more echoes coming back. And the more quickly they come back and the higher the frequency is, you know, it travels shorter, but it's giving them more and more information. So say, for example, it's a moth that it wants to eat, or a tasty mosquito. It will pursue it, and it'll go into a pursuit phase, which is fast echolocation pulses. And when it's like decides that this is something that I want to eat, it'll go into a feeding buzz, which is a rapid succession of pulses, which is basically the bat fine-tuning where the insect is so it can have the best chance of capturing it. So if you're listening to the recording of a bat call, it'd just be a chirp, 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 and it keep getting faster until it sounds like somebody pulling a zipper up. And that's a feeding buzz. So every time we hear that, we're like, yes, a mosquito got murdered. So you can kind of tell relatively if a bat's flying in the open or in cluttered environment based on the type of calls. But a colleague of mine did some of her, or I haven't seen her paper yet, but I know it's out there. She was looking at calls of a particular species of bat as they approach and leave their roost tree, as they interact with other bats of their species in that roost, their roost mates. And there is some evidence that based on what the bat's doing, there's a call associated with it. So it's kind of similar to like maybe a bee coming back and, doing its dance, saying there's, pollen over here. And, it's not exactly like that, but there's some kind of interaction there with the behavior of the bat and the call it's emitting around the roost. So there's some evidence that there's a language of some sort, or at least some vocal communication going on just beyond navigating and finding food. Yeah.
We have a bat that's been living on the vent over our garage door for probably like 8 years, 8 or 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always just assumed it was the same bat every year. Is that probably correct? It's just one.
It could be, a short of, putting a little band on like we do to make sure it's the same bat every year. The likelihood's fairly high. If it's a safe place that a bat's successfully lived at for a while, it meets all of its needs, bats are very loyal to their roost sites. They'll leave and hibernate for the winter and come right back to the area. They'll hibernate in the same spot. That one bat that I talked about that was over 34 years old that we kept finding in the state, they would find it hibernating in the same spot every year, except that once they started taking him down to verify it was him and he was healthy, he kept moving higher and higher up so that they couldn't reach him. So they're very smart, and they have great memories as far as like spatially in that. So it could very well be the same bat, or at least it could, if there was a young bat produced there, if you ever saw a female. I mean, generally...
There was one out of all those summers, 1 year there was two.
Mm-hmm.
And they cuddled together. So
yeah, it's hard to say if that was a female with their young, and then maybe now the young, that bat is back. But yeah, I mean, there's a high likelihood that it's the same bat.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't say 100%, but good chance.
We have a question online.
How is it that bats could exist for 50 million years and all of a sudden they're threatened?
Well, that's a good question. Well, a lot of it can be tied back to us, humans. And we are very good at circumnavigating our globe and traveling. We have interests that, we travel for fun and do different things. We have, our activities as far as like renewable resources and the way we manage our landscape and interact with our landscape. We've altered the environment in a way that impacts animals that, just wasn't an impact in the past. And so for white-nose syndrome is a really good example. The fungus we might find out has very well been here for millions of years, but it's a big jump across the ocean for that to get here. And it got to the United States by a person caving in a site over there, didn't know to decontaminate his gear, came to the United States, went caving, and the spores dropped off, and the conditions were perfect, and it took off. So a lot of it has to do with just, a chance of something happening because of something that we've done, or, it's just the conditions are right for an impact to affect a large number of bats and other wildlife species. So there's it's an intricate web of things that sometimes causes these impacts.
Is it reasonable to assume then that the same precipitous decline has not taken place in Eurasia?
It's a good assumption that that may have happened. Yep. That's what part of the research of them looking at the history of the fungus over there, potentially of impacting those bat species. Like, did the bats evolve with it? You know, was the fungus there and the bats there kind of grew up with it and just have always been this way? Or did it all of a sudden start affecting cave hibernating bats there, and they went through a population decline and maybe lost a species like we potentially could be? That I still haven't heard the final word about, but they're looking at that as a way of kind of predicting what could potentially happen here, or a way to try to get ahead of it happening and
Say
prevent it.
something about the laws that would keep us from importing the bats from Eurasia.
What's that?
I'm sure there's federal laws that
Oh, yeah,
prohibit
there's
bringing,
yeah, there's
transplanting.
wildlife protection laws and, you know, Endangered Species Act and other laws in place that wouldn't allow bats to be imported from other countries.
I have a question. I'm just a little curious if there's been any research or studies based on the whitenose fungus. I'm assuming it's a parasitic fungus. Typically, in a natural environment, it has a co-competitor, which is also a parasitic fungus. Has there been any studies overseas in its natural environment that has kept it at bay there versus here because of a parasitic fungus that overtakes an area or keeps that population down by attacking it?
Yeah. So speaking of bats over there, you know, they're living with it. So the fungus is actually growing on bats that hibernate over there, but the bats aren't dying like they are here. So there's some level of tolerance from the bats in Europe and Asia that is happening. So, but there is a lot of research, as you were talking about, looking at particularly in caves and that in the United States here. In Wisconsin, I know it's happening, where samples are being taken from the cave environment to look at the naturally existing bacteria, fungus, anything that might be there, and then looking at how it interplays with the white-nose fungus. And there's actually really positive results looking at some natural bacteria that actually inhibit the growth of the white-nose fungus or outcompete it, but doesn't affect the bats. So there's a lot of control measures and that kind of interaction of another bacteria or fungus affecting white-nose by either eradicating it or at least inhibiting it to a level where it won't impact the bats is going on with some positive results. And a friend of mine is actually, a lot of his work is done in China on some of the cave sites. He's looking at the prevalence of the fungus, or at least the same fungus in the family of funguses that is similar to the white-nose syndrome causing fungus, to look at those questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm intrigued. I do have a big flower garden, and it gets 6 hours plus of sunlight. How tall of a pole would my husband have to put up to put a bat house?
So the bottom of the bat house, if you've seen bat houses, they're kind of like they come in a variety of sizes, but really they're a box with an access point underneath, and they have a landing pad that extends below. So that lower part of the bat house should be no lower than 10 feet. I usually shoot for 12 feet above the ground. And that is simply because bats swoop out of there when they leave. And if it's too low, there's a high chance that predators may be down there that could, especially cats are really efficient at snagging bats out of the air. So the higher the better. And so a minimum of 10 feet for the lower part of the bat house. So I usually use like a 16-foot treated 4x4. And I will put a number of feet in the ground, and have the bat house at the top. There are plans out there for pivoting poles, so you don't have to handle such a big piece of lumber at once. You can actually make a piece that goes in the ground, and then the upper part gets bolted in and raised up, kind of like a flagpole setup, if you've seen those. But
Oh, one more online.
Couple more online. There was a professor in Georgia looking at spraying fungicide in hibernacula. Any idea how this is progressing?
There is good positive movement in that. A lot of those studies are taking place in artificial hibernacula, or at least not the native or natural cave environments that I'm aware of. Usually it's mines or, like I mentioned, old military bunkers and that bats have moved into. But there's a variety of progress on the fronts as far as different chemicals that, and not just chemicals, but natural, like volatilized organic compounds that can be introduced into a system, and it's been shown some positive results for reducing fungal loading.
Got another question. So what does light pollution effect have on bats? And is there any research on the loss of insects due to light pollution, which might impact bats and other insect-feeding nocturnal birds?
I don't know too much about those impacts. I can just wager a guess that increase in light pollution definitely affects how animals behave. So it could be artificially drawing insects into an area, and we've probably all seen bats occasionally foraging around lights, the sodium lights on the long streets and other things like that. So, potentially as more lights come in, that could affect how insects are distributed across the landscape and may draw bats into situations where they just would simply be impacted more by their closeness to our environment, whether that be buildings or coming into closer contact with domestic animals or things like that. But I can't say 100% for sure how to answer that as far as statistics or numbers. But good question, though.
I have a question. Maybe 6 months or a year ago, the study from Germany came out about the 70% or so reduction in flying insects in their arboretums and things like this. And I'm reading an article right now about piggybacking on that, and it talks about the secondary problems that come with that. So we see this huge decline in insects, but what then we actually see on the landscape are dead bats and things like this that eat the insects. So I know a lot of the concentration is on whitenose, but how much work do you do directly with their diets as well to see how those are being affected with this huge decrease in their food?
I don't specifically, but I know that there is research being conducted as far as, the impact on insect populations if their prey or their predators are declining. How is the increase infecting those? But then also, landscape. There's landscape level work being done as far as the bats' use of the landscape, and that I can't say exactly. Answer your question specifically about the effects of the declines in insects on the bats. I would imagine, though, just based on 70% of our bats in the U.S. being insect eaters, that if we see a sharp decline in their prey, I would imagine that we would see declines in the birds and bats that rely on them. I know climate change is another one that's tied in there. It's such an intricate web. Everything's really connected, and climate change has that potential too of, changing the phenology of everything. So if it's getting warmer earlier and, insects have adapted to come out when the temperature gets a certain, certain degree, but then daylight, dictates when plants are available. You could have insects coming on the landscape and their, plants they rely on aren't available. So then you have a decline there, and then that trickles down to the predators. So that's kind of a quagmire of an answer, but.
Any other questions?
I have a question too. I traveled to New Zealand a couple years ago, and I was interested to learn that their only native mammals are 2 bats. How do you think they got there?
Boy, that is a good question, because Hawaii, its only native mammal is a bat, which is a hoary bat, which is similar to the hoary bat that we have here. So that is a really good question. I could hazard a guess, or I don't know for sure how they got there. I'm just assuming that it could be when, as far back as when, the continents were more connected or closer together. Bats may have just shifted over, and then when, the megacontinent broke up, or they just stayed there and became their own independent species. That is a really wing it guess.
All right, a perfect ending. All right, thank you so much, Brian.